Hello everyone, welcome to the Frontend crash course. In the previous lecture, we built a very simple login form with just a username and a password field. Today, let's learn how to make it more reactive. First, when user types something in the input field, I don't want the label username to disappear like that. I want it to jump out and stay on top of the text box. In prompt view, that behavior can be achieved using a float label. As you can see here, we have a text box with label username. And when I click on the box, the label immediately flies to the top. Gives way for the user to enter a value. The code to do this is pretty simple. Just use a float label component to wrap around an input text and a label. Let's copy this piece of code and paste it inside the input group component. I'm gonna remove the vModel property for now. We'll learn about it in a moment. The for property of the label must match the ID of the input text, which is username in this case. Now we can delete the old input text component. Save the file and check the web UI. Oops, somehow the text box is not displayed nicely. Let's take a look at the code to find out what happened. Alright, so it seems we forgot to import the float label component. We can copy the import statement from the prompt view documentation page and paste it to the script section. Now if we save the file and check the UI again, the text box will be nicely displayed as before. But this time, when we click on the box, the label username will move to the top. Pretty cool, isn't it? Let's do the same thing for the password field. I'm going to copy the whole float label block of the username input group and paste it inside the password input group. Now we must change the type of the input text to password. Also, its ID and the for property of the label should be password as well. The label to display on the UI must also be changed to password. Then we can get rid of the old input text component. Okay, let's save the file and try it on the UI. We can see that the labels of the username and password move out of the box when we type something. However, they also move back in when we click somewhere outside of the text box. And now the values we just entered and the label of the text box are mixed together. This happened because the value of the input text box is not recorded anywhere. So when we click outside, the float label component doesn't know that a value has been entered. That's why it displays the label inside the text box. To fix this, we must find a way to tell the float label about the current value of the input text. For that, we'll use something called a vModel. In the script section, I'm going to declare two constants for the username and the password, with an initial value of empty string. Here I use a ref function of view to make them reactive, which means the reference value of these constants can change depending on the user's interaction with the component they link to. In this case, we want the reference value of the username to link to the username input text. So we can add a vModel property to this component with value username. If you hover your mouse over it, press Command and click, you will see that it really links to the username constant we declared above. Alright, now let's do the same for the password field by adding a vModel property to its input text component with value password. It will link to the constant password we declared above. Okay, so now the value we enter into the text boxes will be recorded in those two constants. And the float label component will know about those values. And thus, the labels are no longer moved back into the box, but stay on top of them. Only when we delete the value from the text box, which means the value is empty, and the label will move back in as expected. This form looks pretty good now, but we're still missing a button to submit the form. So in prompt view, let's look for the button component. First, I'm going to copy this import statement, paste it into the script section. Then let's copy this line of code and paste it under the password input group. We should rename its label to login because that's the action we want the users to perform. Now back to the UI, we have a lovely green login button, which we can click on. However, It is clickable even when no username and password are provided. This is not very good because empty values are not acceptable for those fields. What we want is the button should be disabled until both the username and password are filled. Let's change the code a little bit to support this behavior. I'm gonna declare a new constant called isLoginDisabled and set its value to not username.value or not password.value. What does this mean? Well, since username and password are reference constants, when using them inside the script section, we must use the dot value to access their reference value. But the dot value is not needed when we use them in the template section. So this expression basically means that if the username or password are empty, then isLoginDisabled will be true. Now we can add :disable attribute to the button component and set its value to isLoginDisabled. The colon here is a form of dynamic binding that allows us to write some script inside it. This way, it can understand that we are referring to the reference value of isLoginDisabled and not a plain text value as in the login label. Alright, now let's save the code and check it on the UI. The login button is now disabled because both username and password are empty. Let's enter some values to see how it goes. Although we've input the values for both username and password, the button remains disabled. This means we must have a bug somewhere. Let's clear out the input values and check the code. The problem is the isLoginDisabled constant is not reactive, so its value stays the same even though the value of username and passwords have changed. To make it reactive, we can use the computed function of view. Here we don't use ref because it's not referencing just one value, but it must be computed from two other values of the username and password. And for those who don't know, this is just a syntax to declare an arrow function in TypeScript. We do this because the computed function expects a function as input argument. Alright, now the isLoginDisabled constant should be reactive. We can save the file and test it on the UI. First, the button is disabled. If we enter some values for both username and password, it will be enabled. But if either the username or password is empty, the button will be disabled again. And that's exactly the behavior that we wanted. This brings us to the end of this lecture. I hope you have learned something new and interesting. Thanks a lot for watching, happy learning, and see you in the next video where we'll learn how to send HTTP requests to the backend side.